Hi, my name is Catherine Leonard. I'm from Occidental College in Los Angeles in the US, presenting joint work on perceptually grounded quantification of shape complexity with collaborators Dina Bazazian, Bonnie Maglin, Cindy Prim, and Aaron Chambers. So if you look in the literature, there are a ton of definitions of shape complexity. One is the number of ellipses in an equal area shape covering. So you have a collection of ellipses with the same area. You count the number of those you need to cover your shape, and that number is a proxy for complexity. There's the speed of triangulation of the boundary of the shape. This is a measure of sinuosity, which is a way of measuring complexity. There are a bunch of correlates of Kolmogorov complexity. So in the top row here, you see the circle is the simplest shape and a random collection of dots is the least predictable and therefore most complex shape. You can see in the bottom row, there's a human moving around and the complexity numbers stay more or less the same, which is what you would want from a shape complexity measure. Way back when in my PhD thesis, I proposed an epsilon entropy version of complexity that measured the number of bits required to epsilon approximate a shape in a C1 kind of metric. Other collections of complexity measures come out of particular applications where what's being captured by complexity is whatever is useful in that application. So there are complexity measures for construction plans, some phytoplankton image retrieval processes, first cluster images in terms of their shape complexity, and then don't try to image match within different complexity chunks. Robotic grasping for picking things up, and handwriting recognition that's done by comparing the most complex character between two writing samples. But Aaron, Tegan, Cindy, and I wanted to establish a baseline, like outside of all of these other concerns, is there some sort of intrinsic foundational complexity measure that we can develop? We did this in Turkey at the Nessun Math Village on a research retreat. And first we set out to figure out what do we mean by complex? What are the fundamental principles here? So first of all, the circle should be the least complex. Adding parts to a shape should not decrease complexity, though it might not increase complexity. A shape with the same number of parts as another shape where all the parts are similar shouldn't be more complex than the one where that same number of parts has dissimilar parts. And then we weren't expecting that shapes together with a complexity measure would be linearly ordered, but we think that it should be partially ordered, where orderings hopefully will tease out some particular aspect of complexity. And then we identified some fundamental complexifying operations, adding parts by making protrusions, adding parts by making indentations, sharpening and softening those parts, adding handles, which we don't talk about in this work, and then adding details, whether meaningful details like feathers or meaningless details like noise on the boundary. So we looked at all of the complexity measures that we could find in the literature. We added some new ones of our own. We ended up with a set of 281 total measures that were purportedly capturing some aspect of complexity. Some of those measures were area-based, and so we applied them to image regions, downsampled at 4 levels with shifts in where the shape appears in the image to avoid biasing. Some of the measures are boundary-based, and so we ended up applying those to downsampled boundaries, where we had 5 levels of downsampling, and again, we would start the starting point of the downsampling at different places. So each level of downsampling for a particular shape will actually have multiple representations. And then we had some measures based on the skeleton of the shape, the Blum medial axis. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then we had some self-similarity measures, which turned out not to be useful. And so this is the last you'll hear of them. So there were a ton of boundary-based measures. Some of them were persistent. Some of them were, global. So ratio of the perimeter to the area of the shape, and then the total curvature of the boundary. These are things that are fixed. And then we looked at a bunch of things that persisted over downsampling. So the ratio of the length of the downsample to the original, ditto for boundary to the area, ditto for the area. The L2 norm on the error introduced by downsampling globally, the Hausdorff norm globally, and then a histogram of errors between the downsampled boundary and original. So looking at point-wise distances, histograms of point-wise curvatures, histograms of tangent angles, histograms of differences in tangent angles to make it embedding invariant, and then a bunch of stuff involving the Voronoi diagram, the Delaunay triangulation. That is also related to our skeletal measures, but we thought we would see if we could get at them with a less complicated computation. shorter list of region-based measures, the ratio of the area of the downsampled shape to the area of the original shape, and then the histogram of the percentage of pixels that are filled when you take the downsampled version and blow it back up to the original size compared to the original percentage of pixels that are filled. These skeleton-based measures require a little explanation. So each 2D shape has a Blum medial axis that consists of the skeleton and a radius function. The points on the skeleton are the centers of maximally inscribed circles contained inside the shape. So as that circle like rolls around and grows and shrinks, the centers trace out the points on the skeleton, and then the radius values are what live inside of R. And there are measures that you can define on the skeleton. There are two depth-based measures that we looked at. One is a length-based depth. So the depth at this point would be this distance. One is a volume-based depth. So the depth of this point from the volumetric perspective would be the volume of this piece of the shape that contains that point. There are some blobbiness and tubiness measures. The erosion thickness is that length-based measure minus the radius function value at each point, and shape tubularity is the erosion thickness divided by the depth. So shape tubularity picks up tubiness, erosion thickness picks up blobbiness. So we looked at histograms, no downsampling here, just the histogram across the skeleton of the EDF. That's the length-based depth, the WEDF, that's the volume-based depth, the blobbiness, the tubiness, and then so those first four are for all the points in the skeleton. And then for these last two, the neighbor EDF and WEDF, these are the depths, the length-based and the volume-based depths, but just looking at points where branches in the skeleton meet. So like there, and the immediate neighbors of those points. We use the MPEG-7 dataset, which is based on the Kimia dataset. It has thousands of shapes in almost 100 different shape categories. And then we did a bunch of different analyses, but since this isn't in actually the paper I'm presenting, I'll just say that the best kind of result that we got from this initial investigation was a clustering into complexity classes using all of those measures. And so if you just kind of glance at this casually, it looks like it's doing a pretty good job, like shapes are in like places, but then when you look a little more closely, these are pretty complicated shapes compared to this triangle. So the triangle probably shouldn't be in the pink cluster. And then this deer looks out of place. It should probably be in the blue cluster. And in the blue cluster, we have a few really simple shapes together with some pretty complicated shapes. And so the measures are getting something when we use them all at once, but they aren't really getting where we wanted to do. So that was previous work. The work that in this particular paper, we thought, well, hey, we just used our eyeballs as users to determine whether those clusters were good or not. And so really, we should be more scientific about this and do a user study. So we paid some Mechanical Turk people pretty well to answer the following question for sets of pairs of shapes. So we would present them with a pair of shapes and then ask them 4 questions about that pair. Which shape is more complex, which is harder to draw from memory, which is longer to trace, takes longer to trace, and which is harder to cut out with scissors. And the idea behind asking all of these questions is that people who aren't thinking about shape complexity might not understand what which shape is more complex even means. And so then the next 3 questions are getting at different interpretations of why a shape might be complex. So why are we not moving forward? There we go. So to the MPEG-7 data set, we added some additional hand edited shapes with kind of controlled complexity. So we would take a shape in the database, remove all of its parts, and then gradually add them back. So that's the full collection of the hand edited shapes. And then we did the user study, and then we did rank SVM on the user data, looking at our measures, and found the measures that were most highly correlated with the user study results. And there were the top 6 measures appeared in the top 10 of correlation ordering for all 4 questions. But some of these are highly correlated with each other. And so we picked out 3 uncorrelated measures: the boundary error, bin 1 level 4, so the 4th level of downsampling. The lowest level of pointwise error is the boundary error, bin 1 level 4. The neighbor WEDF, bin 1, so that's the bin that has the neighbors of the volume-based depth measures being the smallest, the difference being the smallest between a branch point and its neighbors. And then curvature, bin 5 level 5, so that's the 5th level of boundary downsampling, bin 5 out of 10 bins of pointwise curvature values. So this is looking at mid-range curvature values that persist after downsampling. So that was phase 2. And then phase 3, which I did in the Summer Geometry Institute at MIT last summer, which is really great. You should send your students there. We added 2 new collaborators, Dina Bazazian and Bonnie Mackland. And we wanted to analyze these results. In particular, we wanted to answer 2 questions. Do these 3 measures generate a ranking that largely agrees with human perception of complexity? And can we identify each measure with a specific type of complexification? Like, are these 3 measures sort of aligning with our understanding that we laid out at the beginning of the foundational principles of complexity? So to answer the first question, we first looked at the Kendall's-Tau rank correlation between all of our measures and the user rank, and then the 3 measures that we picked out and the user rank. So in the full measure, the correlation of using all of the measures with the user rank gives us pretty good correlations up here. And then when we drop down to just using the 3 measures that we picked out, that correlation decreases somewhat, but not a ton. And so those 3 measures are actually doing a pretty good job of correlating with a user study. Moreover, if you look at them, so the rank SVM puts out a unit vector. That unit vector is giving a direction when who's ordering along the vector gives the ordering of the complexity of the shapes. So this is a unit length vector, and those 3 measures that we picked out, their coefficient weights are contributing almost 42% of the total unit weight of the entire measure. So these 3 measures are carrying a lot of the load of the full measure correlation. So we wanted to dig a little deeper. So we simulated some shapes with controlled complexity measures. The first data set that we looked at was a polynomially generated data set where we had 4 levels, and each level had an increased polynomial degree to allow for more partiness. And the second set was a set that we call noisy circles. We started with a circle, did a random walk around the circle boundary, adding pixels in one direction or removing them in another randomly. We did 8 iterations of this, and each iteration generated a circle of increasing complexity. And to these, we added the hand-edited shapes that I talked about before. So that we took our 3 measures and we applied them to these shapes. Because they have controlled complexity, if our measures are picking out complexity differences, they should be able to distinguish between our sort of intentionally introduced complexity levels. What we found was that none of these measures do that on a shape-to-shape basis. If I give you a shape at level 1 and a shape at level 4 and ask a measure, tell me which one, it's like a coin flip whether or not it'll make the less complex one more or less complex than the more complex one. But when you aggregate them across the levels, the distributions are distinguishable. So with our curvature measure, we found that we could very well distinguish between the lowest level of complexity of the poly shapes and the highest level of complexity. The middle, it's a little harder, but there's a clear difference between high and low. For the neighbor WEDF measure, we found that we couldn't distinguish within levels of a specific data set, but we could distinguish between the types of complexity in 2 data sets. So the blobs, these poly shapes, are much less complex according to the neighbor WEDF than the noisy circles. So neighbor WEDF is distinguishing between like parts and details from our original description. The boundary measure did a reasonable job of distinguishing between the lowest level complexity of the hand-edited shapes and the full complexity, though you can see because these shapes all have their sort of own inner complexity, it's much harder. The overlap is bigger and the spread is much bigger. And then finally, when we combine the 3 measures together, we find that we can again distinguish between categories of complexity. So when we use the full 3 measure, when we combine the 3 measures to be one rank SVM measure, we find that the blobs are the lowest complexity, the hand-edited shapes are in the middle, and the circles are at the top. So combining them again doesn't help us with internal complexity distinguishing, but it helps us distinguish between different types of complexity. So our conclusions are, do these 3 measures generate a ranking agreeing with users? Yes, that's great. However, not a shape-to-shape comparison. And then can we identify each measure with a type of complexification? And the answer is yes, but only at a very large scale. Only when we aggregate measures can we distinguish between clumps of complexities. Again, we can't do shape-to-shape. So we're still seeking a good shape-to-shape complexity framework. None of the measures were able to do anything at all reasonable with the circles data set, even though there were 8 levels of complexity. So maybe we're missing a piece of the puzzle here. We wanted to distinguish between shapes that had high user disagreement in complexity comparisons, because those might be shapes that aren't in the same ordering. That could help us understand the partial ordering. And then we wondered if there were other data sets that we could simulate that capture other aspects of complexity, and therefore identify other of those 281 measures that might be useful. So thank you all very much for your time. These are my funding sources, and enjoy the rest of your conference.